So this is a suggested structure for paper number 1. And I'm going to be posting this also on Blackboard. So even though I'm holding it up here, you'll also see this listed on the announcement section of Blackboard. As you can tell, I miss my whiteboards, my dry erase whiteboards in the classroom. So I like to use this just to get my thoughts down and to sort of imitate what I normally do in an in-person class. And so you'll notice here that I have some of the basic elements of the structure for paper number 1 that, as I said, we'll start working on this week. So I want to talk a little bit about structure today and also about how to approach this assignment as you start thinking about it. So some of the things listed down here are very basic. We have the introduction, I have some suggestions for the body of the paper, and then also for the conclusion. So let me talk a little bit about each one individually, and then I'll put the board down and I'll give you some more detail on how to approach it. This first paper is a narrative essay. So one thing to keep in mind about the introduction is you do need to be very specific about what job it is that you're going to be writing about. Now, again, it could be a volunteer experience. It could be the very first job you ever had. It could be a job that someone else in your family or a friend of yours had. If you'd rather write about someone else in the way that Mike Rose does, that's appropriate. But I do need to know in the first paragraph of this essay what job it is that you're writing about, or again, volunteer experience. And then what I'd also recommend for the opening paragraph of this is to at least give me some hint or suggestion about the skills that were developed at that job. And I'll talk about that more in a second. But again, because this is a narrative paper, it's not going to have the kind of specific thesis necessarily that we're going to have with all of the subsequent papers for this class. You're still telling me a story, and you're trying to engage me from that opening paragraph. Now, for the body, for something of this length, it's a 3-page paper, I would suggest having at least 3 or 4 body paragraphs. And you'll notice on the prompt that one of the things I mentioned as a way of structuring the middle of the paper would be to select 3 skills that were developed at the job. That way you could devote each one of those body paragraphs in the middle of the paper to one of those skills, and maybe to the incidents or experiences that taught you how to develop those skills. Then you get to the conclusion. Now, I mentioned with this essay that you can use quotations. You can use quotations from Mike Rose. If you want to, you can use quotations from Toni Morrison. At the very end of the directions, in fact, I go into some detail about how to use MLA citation format, how to quote directly from something and do it correctly. This is going to be a bit of a practice run. I know a lot of you probably did use MLA formatting when you were in high school. You may or may not remember how to do it. If you've never done it, we're going to talk more about it. I'll do another video about it later this week. But this is, again, more of a narrative paper, which means that using quotations will depend upon what your essay is about, and also how you want to approach it and how you feel it connects in with some of the readings that we did. So I'm recommending that you may consider using a direct quotation from either Rose or Morrison in your conclusion, especially if you're trying to mimic the way in which they lead up to the lessons that they're trying to teach. Okay, so those are some basic ideas. Let me break them down a little bit more and get out from behind this little whiteboard here. For the introduction for this, one way to approach it is to think about one particularly memorable incident maybe that happened. And as I mentioned in the Toni Morrison video, you want to be as concrete as possible. So one thing to avoid in an essay like this is to say, this job was very difficult. I found it hard to do. Because as a reader, I'll want to know, well, what made it difficult? What made it so challenging? And the best way to engage the reader's interest and also to sustain that interest for the essay is to start off with a really memorable moment, an incident maybe from the job. Maybe it's an incident that you first start describing and then get into more detail later. If you remember the first video that I posted a couple of weeks ago, or one of the first ones, I mentioned that job I had at the factory that made those mirrors for the compacts. And I talked about almost blowing up the microwave because I didn't realize that that canister of SpaghettiOs that I had was actually metal because it was wrapped in that plastic stuff. So maybe if I were writing about that, I could start off the essay by saying, at that particular moment, at this summer job that I had, I very nearly blew up the microwave because I wasn't paying attention. And maybe that's one of the skills that I had to learn at that job. I think it was, now that I look back on it, was to be more observant, to be more careful about my surroundings, particularly in an environment like that, an industrial environment where things can be dangerous. There's these giant machines that are running all day. And I think one of the lessons that my friend Ron, who I mentioned in that video, was trying to impart to me was to be observant, to be careful about my surroundings, to be aware of where I was, and to do my best, not only to do my job, but also to keep everybody else safe. And that's a lesson that I think I took with me later on into college. Again, just about being observant, also being observant in such a way that I could then describe what I was seeing in my own writing. So your introduction, it should be engaging. I'm not necessarily a huge fan of the attention-getting opening paragraphs. Sometimes that can work really well. Sometimes it can be a bit of a trap, because if you're spending all of your time trying to craft this amazing introductory paragraph, often what will happen is that you neglect later parts of the essay, and I'll talk about that more here in a second. So you don't want the introduction to be so perfect that you don't have enough time to spend on the rest of the piece, because the introduction ultimately is going to be the last thing that the reader remembers. It's the ending, actually, that's the last thing that you leave them with, and that's got to be as strong, if not stronger, than the introduction. Now, for the body of this essay, I'm going to suggest a very basic structure. Now, again, anytime I give you any of these suggestions, you can modify them. It's a suggestion to kind of get you started. Again, when I was an undergraduate and I was taking my first year writing class like this, I appreciated that kind of suggestion, that kind of structure, even if I didn't always follow every little aspect of what the teacher, my teacher, Melissa Zeiger, who was one of the best teachers I had in college, had her for not only first year writing, but also for a later literature course that I took in my sophomore year. And she was always very good about telling us, here's a possible way to do this. So in much the same way, what I'm going to suggest for the body of this essay is to think about how you can structure those 3 body essays according to specific skills that you had to develop at this workplace. And for each one of those skills, you can talk about a specific incident or experience that helped you to develop that skill. And that would, I think, make for a nice body section of the paper, 3 or 4 body paragraphs for the center. And when I say paragraphs, I'm thinking 5 or 6 sentences at minimum for each one. Now, for this one, because it's a narrative, you will probably only end up using 1 quotation, maybe 2 from these essays. And I think of those as either appearing in the body of the essay, and let me give you an example of that. If you've ever worked as a server, much like Mike Rose's mom, maybe you'll see something in her experiences and his descriptions of her experiences that resonates with your experiences on the job, at a restaurant, at a diner. So as you're reading or rereading Mike Rose, you might find something that he says about her work or about his uncle's work that resonates with your experience, and that you could therefore use a quotation from in order to support one of your descriptions. Now, the other alternative to this is to sort of mimic the way that Rose and Morrison end their essays. They do end them with these kind of lessons. I mentioned in my last video that they're almost like parables, like fables, where you end up with a lesson being communicated very explicitly to the reader in that final paragraph. So in the past, when I've taught these essays and I've given this assignment, I've had some students that wait till the very end, and that's where they quote from Rose or they quote from Toni Morrison, and they do a sort of short comparison to end the paper between their experiences, or the experiences of the person maybe that they're writing about, and the experiences that were expressed by Rose. Now, again, in Rose's case, he's trying to make an argument that we shouldn't take any kind of work for granted, that we should respect all different types of work, no matter whether it's more physical labor oriented, whether it's more mental labor, whether it's a combination of the two. Toni Morrison, at the end of her piece, is making an argument about family and putting family priorities over work priorities as best you can. I mean, that's not always possible, but that's one of the arguments that she's trying to impart on us at the end of that essay. So I've seen students over the years use a quotation from one of those main ideas at the end of the Morrison or the Rose essay and then respond to it. And that makes for often a very strong conclusion, because conclusions can be difficult. Let's be honest. I mentioned a little bit earlier in this video that we are often taught to spend so much of our time focusing on the introduction that we often leave out other pieces of the essay, particularly the conclusion. And one thing I do want to stress is that this is your first paper for the class. It's not going to be perfect, okay? It will have flaws. That's fine. That's why we do the required revision in the middle of the semester. So as I've said in previous videos, I just want you to do the best you can. I want you to think about these structuring or structural advice as a possible way to approach your paper. I am happy to read any drafts. If you want to get started and you have a couple of paragraphs, and if you want to see if you're on the right track, I'll be happy to read them. If you have a full draft and you want me to take a look at that and give you some suggestions, please send it to me. I'll be happy to give you advice and ideas on it. One thing I would mention, when you're sending me any drafts that you want me to comment on, the easiest way for me to write comments is either through a Google Doc, because I can type the comments right on there. Microsoft Word is also great because I can type the comments in the margins. It's a little trickier with a PDF. So one thing I'd ask you when you're sending me a draft is try not to send it in that PDF format. I can read it, but PDFs are a lot harder to comment on. There's a way to do it, but what I've found over the years is not every student that I've had has the Adobe Acrobat program that you necessarily need to be able to see the comments in a PDF document. They really are designed to be read-only pieces. So if you want to send me a draft, Google Docs by far is the easiest one to use. But again, any other format that allows me to give you some commentary back, just particularly directly on the document that you sent, is probably best. And again, if you send me something and I have any issues with it, I'll either convert it myself or I'll ask you maybe to send me a different version. So don't worry too much about that, but I thought I should mention it because a couple of you had asked, like, well, what formats are best for these papers and these drafts? So to sum up in this little bit of introduction to the first paper, think about that structure. I'll also type it up so you'll see it on Blackboard. And then in another video later this week, I'll talk about some of the other requirements of the paper, some other suggestions. I'll even take some sample paragraphs that I'm going to show you from previous students who did this assignment for my class, for my English 101 class, and we'll see how they solve some of the problems, some of the issues that come up when you're writing an essay or a narrative essay like this, okay? So again, if you have any other questions, please let me know. I hope you enjoy the Toni Morrison reading. She's one of the best. I mean, there's some good stuff in there, so I hope you enjoy that. Maybe you'll read it and want to read some of her other material when you have time. So send me along questions, and later this week I'll give you some other suggestions, some other advice, and I'll talk a little bit more about the Morrison essay and how it connects to our own pieces in the next video. Okay, see you then.